On Thursday, the Treasurer Josh Frydenberg announced that this year the federal budget deficit had increased to $134 billion. Since 2013, when the coalition was elected, gross debt has more than tripled to $817 billion and remains on track to top $1 trillion. That's 1,000 billion dollars. In dollar terms, the budget deficit is the biggest in Australian fiscal history and the largest as a share of GDP since World War II. Remember the back in the black budget, which actually wasn't? Remember the back in the black mugs and the t-shirts that were made to celebrate the coalition's budget achievements that never were? Remember the Liberals telling us that under Labor, Australia was suffering a debt and deficit disaster? Well, since then, things have gotten much, much worse. The Liberals and Nationals have promised 8 surpluses and then delivered 8 deficits, the latest one being the biggest in the nation's history. Now, I'm not going to sit here and contend that significant fiscal support has not been necessary throughout the COVID pandemic. Any spending that has helped Australians affected by the pandemic is welcome. But with $1,000 billion of national debt forecast, you would think the Morrison government would be adopting a prudent approach to budgeting. Instead, Treasurer Frydenberg used the announcement of a record deficit to open the door to income tax cuts. He said he was always on the lookout for opportunities to cut personal income taxes. Now, rather than playing Santa Claus, the Treasurer should have been talking about a responsible plan to erode those deficits and pay back the debt. It's time for someone in government to start an honest conversation about the hard choices needed to repair Australia's budget bottom line. Or maybe this is an opportunity for Labor. The final years of the Howard government were characterised by profligate expenditure and irresponsible tax cuts. As opposition leader, Kevin Rudd called it out when he said the spendathon had to stop. And, as history shows, voters rewarded him for it. So, we need to have a grown-up conversation about the state of the budget. Kosha, what do you think?
Well, I don't think Kevin Rudd turned out to be a paragon of fiscal judiciousness in the end. But, hey, you know, Nick, when you're right, you're right. And this absolutely is true. We are addicted to spending. It is not unique to Australia. You can see it in countries all around the world. Back home for me in the US, there's a chart that talks about government spending from FDR till present day, and it grows exponentially under every single president, Republican or Democrat. So absolutely true. And it is harder for the Conservative Party to fight that message because that is part of their core value and their brand. So absolutely, when you're right, you're right. I think, you know, the issue here is what's going to happen with it, because the reality is that we're not going to be able to pay it back. And so what does that mean? It could mean that Australia defaults on the currency. Just because it hasn't happened so far in history doesn't mean it never can. It's definitely going to mean inflation. And it basically means that we're leaving a country that's worse off for our kids and grandkids than the one that we inherited. We're already shoving 12-year-olds in masks, sitting them out of school, and then the cherry on top is handing them these enormous debts and deficits that they're never going to be able to pay back. So I agree with something you said in there that we need to have serious conversations about all sorts of things, from the lethality of a pathogen that thankfully isn't as lethal as we thought it was, to these incredible debts and deficits, to difficult conversations culturally and everything in between. And I'm happy that you raised that, and we'll see how it goes. But I think it's dark days ahead in terms of balancing the budget.
Carolee, does the hypocrisy of it annoy you? The claims of debt and deficit disaster, which is now far, far worse by a significant multitude. I mean, Josh Frydenberg used to say that Margaret Thatcher was his hero, but now he's the king of Keynesian big-time spending. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, Nicholas, I want to say, well done on the editorial. I think you're in a glass house at the moment throwing stones, because you're not actually proposing any solution. I'd be interested to know, you talk about having an honest conversation. What is our Anthony Albanese going to do? Because the quickest way to actually decrease this is to decrease the spending, is to increase taxes and slash spending. What's he going to do? Or is he going to do both of them? I mean, you gave a tiny bit in your editorial. You said, oh, I just want to contend. I mean, for goodness sake, we have never had a pandemic on this scale before, and it's always easy in hindsight to look at that. I could look at the Rudd-Gillard era and all the things that they promised as well. I mean, don't forget under the GFC, global financial crisis, that's a memory for most people now, you know, the debt increased as well. And yeah, they were criticised for it. But I think, you know, if we're going to have an honest conversation, I think we actually need to be honest. What is Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party actually going to do? At the moment, they're sitting on the sidelines watching, you know, a bit of discourse and things happening within the Federal Liberal Party, but they're not actually proposing any solutions. And with all due respect to you, because it's a good editorial, you're not proposing things. You're just giving out discourse on, you know, on federal issues and things without actually giving a solution. So, you know, what spending is going to be slashed and a tax is going to be increased. That's the only way to do it.
Well, to be fair, Carolee, I was simply making the point that at the same time you're announcing the biggest deficit in Australian budget history is probably not the same press conference where you flag income tax cuts. Like, you know, there's got to be some prudency about these things. But Daisy, what do you think?
Oh, look, Nicholas, you're going to be shocked and appalled, but I'm going to agree with most of your editorial as well. As Kosha says, you know, when you're right, you're right. I've been very disappointed by the spending habits of this federal government for quite some time now. I mean, there's no point saying you're a fiscally conservative party and you don't act in a fiscally conservative way. I would argue that the way to stop this last budget complete blowout was to not let the state governments get away with lockdown after lockdown after lockdown. That would certainly have helped keep the budget a little bit more in check, since they wouldn't have had to shell out so much money to people in lockdown. The only thing I might disagree with you on is the solution. I love tax cuts. You know, it makes my inner libertarian really happy. You know, the argument would be that if you cut taxes on businesses, that frees them up, that takes the pressure off, which means they can expand and grow and create more revenue and pay more tax that way without a specific, you know, tax stagnation or tax increase. I do not have a finance background, however, so I will let you fight that out with the economists and the fiscal experts. But yes, Nicholas, that was a good editorial. Thank you very much.